April 6th, 1945, 6:32 in the morning, the waters off Okinawa. A swarm of 196 Japanese aircraft is inbound from Kyushu, flying south in loose formations at altitudes ranging from 50 feet to 15,000 feet. They are the first wave of Kikusui No. 1, floating chrysanthemums, the largest organized kamikaze offensive in the history of warfare, and they are heading for the American Fifth Fleet, anchored in the waters below. The pilots have been briefed. Many of them are barely out of flight school, some with fewer than 100 hours in the cockpit. They have written final letters to their families. They have tied white headbands around their foreheads. Their aircraft are carrying 550-pound bombs, and the delivery mechanism is the aircraft itself, flown at full throttle into the deck of an American warship. There is no release altitude. There is no evasive maneuver after the drop. The bomb and the pilot arrive together. Over the next 2 days, 355 kamikaze aircraft will strike the fleet in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm the combat air patrols and anti-aircraft screens. And this is only the beginning. Between April 6th and June 22nd, 1945, the Japanese will launch 10 major Kikusui waves, totaling roughly 1,465 kamikaze sorties from Kyushu alone, plus hundreds of individual attacks. The Japanese High Command has committed these pilots and the planes they are riding to their deaths on the basis of a strategic calculation that has been building for 6 months. The calculation is simple. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 life, traded for 1 American warship permanently removed from the war. The math, as the Imperial Japanese Navy sees it, is irresistible. A nation that cannot outbuild America in factories can outspend America in willpower. Kill enough ships, and the Americans will calculate that the invasion of the home islands costs more than it is worth. That is the theory. And by every report reaching Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo through the spring of 1945, the theory is working. Japanese communiques during the Okinawa campaign will claim 217 American ships definitely sunk. 217. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports. The greatest naval massacre since Tsushima. There is just one problem with the number. It is a fantasy. The actual number of American ships sunk by all causes during the Okinawa campaign is 36. Not one of them is larger than a destroyer, not a single carrier, not a single battleship, not a single cruiser. The ships the Japanese High Command has written off as destroyed are, in many cases, still floating. Some of them are still fighting. Some of them have been hit, burned, lost hundreds of men, been towed to a lagoon 1,000 miles south, and have already been welded back together and returned to the battle line. And the question that will haunt Japanese naval officers for the rest of their lives, the question they will try to answer under interrogation after the surrender and never fully succeed in explaining even to themselves, is the question this entire investigation is built around. How? How were the Americans repairing ships that should have been at the bottom of the ocean? How were carriers that had been on fire from bow to stern steaming back into formation weeks later, as if nothing had happened? How was a nation that the Japanese naval staff had believed could be broken by the calculus of sacrifice, absorbing that sacrifice, and sending the same ships back for more? The Americans were not invulnerable. That must be said. The toll at Okinawa was savage. Nearly 4,900 American sailors were killed during the campaign, the only major engagement of the war in which Navy dead exceeded Army or Marine dead ashore. The radar picket destroyers, stationed at the outermost edge of the fleet, bore the brunt. Men on those ships described the experience as sitting in a foxhole in the middle of the ocean waiting for an airplane to fall on them. But the ships that were hit and did not sink, and that is most of them, were patched and returned. The fleet absorbed the blow and kept fighting. The question is how. To understand the answer, we have to go back not to Okinawa, not to the Kamikazes, not even to Pearl Harbor. We have to go back to a freezing afternoon in the North Sea in 1916, to a German battlecruiser on fire and flooding, which refused to sink, and which a young American Navy that was watching very carefully decided to learn from. This is the story of how the United States Navy built a damage control system so effective that it broke the fundamental logic of the kamikaze, and of why the nation that sent its sons to die crashing into American flight decks could never explain what happened after the impact. The American damage control system that would save hundreds of ships in the Pacific did not begin with an American idea. It began with a German one. On May 31st, 1916, the Imperial German High Seas Fleet met the British Royal Navy at the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval engagement of the First World War. The British won the strategic contest. The Germans won something the Americans would find more interesting. They won the survival contest. The German battlecruiser SMS Seydlitz took 21 heavy-caliber hits, was torpedoed once, shipped 5,300 tons of seawater, burned for hours, and limped home with her decks nearly awash. She did not sink. Her crew, trained for exactly this kind of emergency, sealed compartments, counter-flooded to correct her list, fought fires in the dark below decks, and kept the engines running while the ship was being torn apart around them. In a British battlecruiser hit by similar fire that same afternoon, the magazines detonated and the ship disappeared in seconds. After the war ended, the United States Navy did something that would seem unremarkable, but would eventually determine the outcome of a conflict 25 years in the future. It studied what the Germans had done. Translated copies of the German damage control regulations were distributed to every American capital ship. Damage control diagrams of the battleship USS New Mexico were circulated alongside the German material. In 1924, the battle fleet appointed a formal investigative board to study the problem and recommend a system for the American Navy. A textbook, Principles of Warship Construction and Damage Control, written by G.C. Manning and T.L. Schumacher, went through multiple editions between 1924 and 1939 and was assigned to midshipmen at the Naval Academy. Its message was direct. A comprehensive understanding of the principles of damage control is an essential part of the training of the young, as well as the experienced naval officer. That sentence sounds routine. It was not. In 1924, most navies in the world treated damage control as a secondary duty, something performed by the engineering department during emergencies. The American Navy was beginning to treat it as a core competence, something every officer needed to understand the way an infantry officer understood marksmanship. The distinction would take 20 years to matter. When it mattered, it would matter more than almost any weapon either side carried into battle. But between that interwar study and the moment it saved the fleet, there had to be a catastrophe. There had to be a failure bad enough to make the entire Navy understand what happened when damage control was treated as theory instead of practice. That failure came on May 8, 1942, in the Coral Sea. The carrier USS Lexington, one of the two largest carriers in the American fleet, was hit during the Battle of the Coral Sea by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. The damage was serious, but not fatal. The fires were brought under control. The ship was recovering aircraft. She was making 25 knots. Her captain believed she would survive. The men on the hangar deck had begun cleaning up debris. Officers were discussing which aircraft could still fly. Then, more than an hour after the attack had ended, with the fires apparently out and the crew standing down from general quarters, the ship exploded. The aviation gasoline storage tanks, ruptured by the torpedo hits, had been leaking fuel vapor into the lower compartments. Nobody had detected it. Nobody had been assigned to monitor it. The vapor found an ignition source, most likely a generator motor that had been left running. The resulting explosion blew out bulkheads across 3 decks and started fires that could not be contained. A second explosion followed, then a third. Each one came from a different part of the ship, as the spreading vapor found new ignition sources in new compartments. Lexington burned through the afternoon, was abandoned, and was sunk by American torpedoes that evening to prevent capture. 216 men died. The largest carrier in the American fleet was gone, not because of the Japanese attack, but because of what happened after the Japanese attack, when the crew believed the emergency was over and stopped paying attention to the damage they could not see. The investigation that followed produced a conclusion that changed the American Navy. The loss of Lexington need not have happened. Better damage control procedures, specifically the detection and ventilation of gasoline vapor, the sealing of fuel lines, and the monitoring of ruptured compartments after the immediate emergency had passed, could have saved the ship. As one historian put it, thereafter firefighting became to the Navy what rifle marksmanship was to the infantry, a basic skill expected of all hands. The Navy looked at the wreckage of its own procedures the same way the Prussians had looked at the wreckage of their army after Jena. They made a decision. They were going to fix this. And they were going to fix it so thoroughly that the next ship hit this badly would not die. What happened next was one of the most concentrated institutional learning efforts any military organization has ever undertaken in the middle of a war. The Bureau of Ships, under Rear Admiral Edward L. Cochrane, began issuing war damage reports for every significant instance of battle damage to an American ship. Each report was a detailed engineering autopsy. What hit the ship, where it hit, what failed, what held, what the crew did right, what they did wrong, what design changes would prevent the failure next time. Those reports were not filed in an archive. They were circulated to every ship in the fleet, and the lessons in them were incorporated into training, into design, and into the equipment carried aboard every vessel from carriers down to destroyer escorts. Two men who had never fired a shot in combat became as important to the survival of the Pacific Fleet as any admiral. Lieutenant Harold J. Burke had been the deputy chief of the New York City Fire Department before the war. Lieutenant Thomas Akilduff had been an officer in the Boston Fire Department. The Navy brought them in because it had realized something embarrassing. The Navy did not actually know how to fight fires at sea, as well as two municipal fire departments knew how to fight fires on land. The tactics the Navy had been using, running a solid stream of water into a burning compartment, were not only inadequate, they were in some cases making the situation worse. Burke persuaded Admiral Cochrane to equip the fleet with a piece of technology that had been standard in American fire departments for years but had never been used aboard a warship: the fog nozzle. A conventional fire hose throws a solid stream of water at the base of a fire. It works in open air. Aboard a ship, in a closed steel compartment filled with burning fuel and superheated metal, a solid stream of water can flash to steam on contact and cook the men holding the hose. The fog nozzle breaks the water into a fine mist that absorbs heat across a wider area, drops the temperature of the compartment, and suppresses fire without creating a steam blowback that kills the firefighters. Burke and Kilduff trained more than 260 instructors, who then staffed firefighting schools at every continental naval base. The schools trained thousands of sailors, not specialists, not engineers, but every man in the crew, because the Navy had made a decision that would separate it from every other fleet on Earth. Every sailor was going to be a firefighter. Every sailor was going to know how to seal a compartment, shore a bulkhead, rig a portable pump, counterflood a listing ship, and run a hose line into a burning space. The Japanese Navy had damage control specialists. The American Navy had damage control as a universal skill. The Naval Damage Control Training Center in Philadelphia became the institutional heart of the program. Its staff, in collaboration with the Bureau of Ships, produced the Handbook of Damage Control in May of 1945, a document that codified everything the fleet had learned in 3 years of combat. Its most famous line captured the philosophy in a single sentence: "If the ship does not sink within a very few minutes after damage, she probably will survive for several hours." And several hours was all the American system needed. The first proof that the new system worked came not at Okinawa, but 3 years earlier, at the battle that turned the Pacific War. And it came in a form so dramatic that the Japanese Navy would spend the next 3 years trying to understand it, and never quite succeeding. May 27, 1942. The carrier, USS Yorktown, limps into Pearl Harbor trailing oil, her flight deck buckled. Her internal structure damaged by a 551-pound armor-piercing bomb that had detonated inside the ship during the Battle of the Coral Sea. The shipyard's initial estimate for repairs is 90 days. Some officers who have seen the damage believe 3 months is optimistic. Admiral Chester Nimitz does not have 3 months. His codebreakers have told him that the Japanese combined fleet is heading for Midway Atoll, and it will arrive in days. Nimitz needs every carrier he has. He inspects the hull in dry dock, turns to the yard commander, and issues an order that will become one of the most famous in American naval history. We must have this ship back in 3 days. More than 1,400 skilled tradesmen at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard worked around the clock for roughly 72 hours. They did not fully repair Yorktown. They made her able to fight. They patched the flight deck. They shored the damaged bulkheads. They restored enough watertight integrity to get her to sea. And they did something else that the repair crews at Pearl Harbor had been learning to do since the days after the December 7th attack. They improvised. Where standard parts were not available, they fabricated them. Where a procedure in the manual would take too long, they invented a faster one. The men in the shipyard were welders, pipe fitters, electricians, and riggers who had been building and fixing things with their hands since before the war. and they brought that civilian instinct, the instinct of the man who looks at a broken machine and simply fixes it, into the most consequential rush job in naval history. On May 30th, Yorktown sailed for Midway. The Japanese did not know she was coming. Their intelligence had assessed Yorktown as out of action for months, possibly permanently. When she appeared on the morning of June 4th, launching aircraft against the Japanese carrier striking force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's staff initially believed she was a different carrier, possibly Saratoga. The idea that the ship they had damaged at Coral Sea could be operational in less than a month did not fit any model of ship repair the Japanese Navy possessed. Hold on to that. Because the confusion the Japanese felt at Midway was the first symptom of a condition that would become chronic by 1945. Ships they had written off kept appearing, targets they had killed kept shooting back, and the model of ship repair they possessed had no category for what the Americans were doing. But the most remarkable demonstration of American damage control at Midway happened that same afternoon. Japanese dive bombers struck Yorktown at approximately noon, scoring 3 bomb hits that started fires, ruptured the uptakes, and killed her boilers. She went dead in the water, listing, burning. Her flight deck was holed. Smoke was pouring from the island. By every expectation, she was finished for the day, if not for the war. The damage control parties went to work. They sealed ruptured steam lines. They extinguished fires in the rag storage and compartments below. They cross-connected undamaged boiler rooms. They patched the flight deck holes with steel plates and timbers. Within 2 hours, they had restored power, corrected the list, and raised enough steam to make 20 knots. Yorktown was recovering aircraft by 2 in the afternoon. When a Japanese torpedo squadron found her 90 minutes later, the pilots believed they were attacking a completely different carrier, because the ship they had seen burning and dead in the water that morning could not possibly be the operational carrier now maneuvering at high speed below them. They hit her with 2 torpedoes. This time the damage was too great. Yorktown lost all power, listed heavily, and was eventually sunk the next day by a Japanese submarine. But the point had been made, and the Japanese Navy had registered it even if they could not explain it. They had hit a carrier hard enough to kill her, and she had come back to life in front of their eyes. And here is the thing you need to hold on to, because it is the key to everything that follows. At the very same battle where Yorktown demonstrated what good damage control could do, the Japanese demonstrated what bad damage control could not. On that same morning, June 4th, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, catching them with armed and fueled aircraft on their hangar decks. The bombs detonated among loaded torpedoes and stacked ordnance. Fires erupted that the Japanese damage control parties could not contain. Water mains had been ruptured. Firefighting equipment was inadequate. The crews had not been drilled for this kind of emergency, because Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized the strike, the attack, the offensive power of the ship, and treated survivability as secondary. All 3 carriers burned and sank. The 4th, Hiryu, was struck later that day and suffered the same fate. 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed in a single morning, not because American bombs were more powerful than Japanese bombs, but because the ships that were hit could not save themselves. At Midway, the 2 navies took the same test on the same day. The American ship survived for hours after being hit because her crew knew how to keep her alive. The Japanese ships died within hours of being hit because their crews did not. That pattern, established on June 4, 1942, would repeat for 3 years. And by 1945, when the Kamikaze campaign turned the act of killing ships into a national strategy, the pattern would break the strategy entirely. The ship that best captures what American damage control looked like at its peak under Kamikaze attack is not a carrier, it is a destroyer. USS Laffey, hull number D724, a 2,200-ton Sumner-class destroyer commanded by Commander Frederick Julian Beckton. On April 16, 1945, Laffey was stationed at Radar Picket Station number 1, the most exposed position in the entire Okinawa screening force, 60 miles north of the main anchorage. Her job was to detect incoming raids and direct combat air patrols to intercept them. She was, by design, the first ship the Kamikazes would see. Beginning at approximately 8:27 in the morning, over a period of roughly 80 minutes, Laffey was attacked by an estimated 22 Japanese aircraft. She was struck by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. Her aft 5-inch gun mount was destroyed. Her fantail was wrecked. Fires broke out in the after deckhouse and spread to the handling rooms below. The rudder jammed. Her steering control was lost. She took fires in multiple compartments. 32 of her crew were killed and 71 wounded, nearly a third of the men aboard. At one point during the attack, with his ship burning, listing, and barely maneuverable, Commander Beckton was asked by a subordinate whether they should prepare to abandon ship. Beckton's answer became the defining statement of American damage control in the Pacific. He said, "I will never abandon ship as long as a single gun will fire." The remaining gun crews kept firing even as the kamikazes kept coming. The men below decks fought fires with every hose line and handy billy they could connect. They shored buckling bulkheads with timbers. They sealed flooding in compartments where the hull had been breached. They did not stop, and Laffey did not sink. She was towed to a repair anchorage, patched, and eventually returned to the United States. She exists today as a museum ship at Patriots Point in South Carolina, and the Navy gave her a name that she carries still, the ship that would not die. Beckton received the Navy Cross. Ensign Robert Clarence Thompson, who left his battle station to lead a fire party aft when the rear of the ship was engulfed in flames, received a posthumous Navy Cross. He was 22 years old. The carriers took worse punishment in terms of casualties and still survived. On May 11, 1945, the carrier USS Bunker Hill, flagship of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, was operating off Okinawa when two kamikazes struck within 30 seconds of each other. The first, a Zero fighter carrying a 550-pound bomb, crashed through the flight deck. The second hit moments later. The resulting fires were catastrophic. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, casualties exceeded 600, including 396 killed or missing and 264 wounded. Among the dead were members of Mitcher's own staff. Mitcher shifted his flag to Enterprise. But Bunker Hill's crew fought the fires for 5 hours, saved the ship, and she steamed to the forward repair base at Ulithi under her own power at 20 knots. Within weeks, she was on her way to Bremerton for full repair. The carrier, USS Intrepid, was hit by a torpedo and 4 separate kamikazes across the course of the war, from the Philippines through Okinawa. After each hit, she was repaired and returned to action. Her own crew gave her the sardonic nicknames Decrepit and the Dry One. She survived the war, served for decades, and is today a museum on the Hudson River in New York. USS Enterprise, the most decorated warship in the history of the American Navy, was damaged by the enemy on 6 separate occasions, absorbing 13 direct hits and 3 near misses across engagements, stretching from the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 to Okinawa in May of 1945. At the Eastern Solomons, 3 bomb hits killed 74 men and wounded 95. Her damage control parties patched her, and she returned to Hawaii under her own power. She would be hit again and again over the next 3 years, repaired each time, and sent back into the fight. On May 14, 1945, a kamikaze struck her forward elevator, hurling it hundreds of feet into the air, killing 14 and wounding 68, finally ending her war. But she did not sink. Enterprise survived. And then there was USS Franklin. She deserves her own chapter, not because she was hit by a kamikaze, because she was not, but because what happened to her on March 19, 1945, is the most extreme test of American damage control any carrier survived, and because the men who saved her represent the system at its rawest. Franklin was operating roughly 50 miles off the Japanese coast when a single Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber broke through the combat air patrol and dropped 2 semi-armor-piercing bombs onto her flight deck. The bombs hit at the worst possible moment. The deck was loaded with armed and fueled aircraft preparing to launch a strike. The explosions set off a chain of secondary detonations, bombs, rockets, and full fuel tanks that turned the carrier into an inferno. The ship lost all power and communications. She listed 13 degrees to starboard. Her own ammunition was cooking off in the magazines below. According to more recent research by the Naval History and Heritage Command, more than 800 men were killed and nearly 500 wounded in that single attack. Across all her wartime actions, Franklin lost 924 men killed, the heaviest loss of life aboard any American warship that survived the war, and the second heaviest on any American warship after the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Captain Leslie E. Gaius ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship. 700 men went over the side into the water, but 106 officers and 604 enlisted men stayed. Among them were 2 men whose actions that day would earn the Medal of Honor. Father Joseph Timothy O'Callaghan was a Jesuit priest serving as the ship's chaplain. He had no combat training. He had no damage control training beyond what every man aboard received. When the bombs hit, he went to work. He organized firefighting parties from scattered groups of dazed and wounded men. He led teams into burning compartments to wet down ammunition that was in danger of detonating. He dragged wounded sailors away from fires. He administered last rites to dying men while standing in passageways where the paint on the bulkheads was blistering from the heat on the other side. He was everywhere on that ship for hours, and the men who survived Franklin remembered him as the reason they kept fighting the fires instead of going over the side. He became the first chaplain in the history of the United States Navy to receive the Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald A. Gary was an engineering officer who discovered that several hundred men were trapped in a smoke-filled mess compartment below the hangar deck, unable to find an exit. Gary found a route through the smoke, led an estimated 300 men out to safety, then went back below and did it again. He then personally went into the engineering spaces and raised steam in one of the boilers, restoring enough power to give the ship headway. He received the Medal of Honor from President Truman on January 23, 1946. Franklin was taken under tow by the cruiser USS Pittsburgh, regained steam, and completed what has been called the most harrowing voyage of the Pacific War, roughly 12,000 miles under her own power to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where she arrived on April 28, 1945. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of men like O'Callaghan and Gary and Thomson and Beckton visible a little longer, and that matters more than I can say. The natural question, the one that every naval historian eventually asks, is not how these individual crews performed, but why the American system kept producing the same result across dozens of ships, dozens of engagements, and 3 years of combat. The answer has 3 parts, and none of them is heroism. Heroism was the product. The answer is what produced the heroism. The first part is training, not specialized training, universal training. The American decision to make every sailor a firefighter and every sailor a damage control responder was not a slogan. It was an operational reality that the Japanese Navy never replicated. On a Japanese warship, damage control was the responsibility of a designated team. When that team was killed or overwhelmed, the rest of the crew had neither the training nor the reflex to pick up the work. On an American warship, the cook knew how to run a hose line. The gunner's mate knew how to shore a bulkhead. The chaplain knew how to organize a fire party because he had been through the same damage control drills as the man who loaded the 5-inch guns. When O'Callaghan led men into burning magazines on Franklin, he was not performing a miracle. He was performing a function the Navy had trained him to perform, on a ship designed to give him the tools to perform it. The second part is design. American warships, and Essex-class carriers in particular, were built with damage control in mind, in a way that Japanese carriers were not. Redundant fire mains meant that if one main was severed by a hit, water could be cross-connected from another main on a different part of the ship. Compartmentalization meant that flooding in one section could be isolated before it spread. Counter-flooding systems allowed the crew to deliberately flood compartments on the opposite side of the ship to correct a list that would otherwise capsize them. Carbon dioxide flooding of aviation fuel lines, a system first used on Yorktown before Midway, could purge the fuel system of explosive vapor before it found an ignition source. The fog nozzle that Harold Burke had brought from the New York Fire Department was standard equipment on every American combatant by 1944. Portable gasoline-powered pumps called Handy Billies, weighing 160 pounds, could be carried to any part of the ship and connected to any water source. The ship was designed to be saved. The Japanese ships were designed to fight. The difference in priority killed the Japanese ships. But training and design do not fully explain why the system worked as well as it did. There was something underneath both that the Navy did not put in any manual because the Navy did not have to. The men who manned the damage control parties were the products of a country that had spent 150 years telling its young men to fix whatever was in front of them without waiting to be told. The welder who sealed a hull breach on a burning carrier had been welding since he was 16 in a shipyard in Camden, New Jersey. The pipe fitter who rigged a bypass around a severed fire main had been fitting pipes in a factory in Pittsburgh since before the war. The electrician who restored power in a blacked-out engine room had been wiring farmhouses in Iowa as a teenager. The Navy taught them where the valves were and what the compartments were called. But the reflex, the instinct to look at a broken thing and start fixing it without waiting for someone to authorize the repair, that came from somewhere else. It came from the same place the Army's squad-level initiative came from. It came from a culture of practical independence that the Japanese Navy had no equivalent of. The Japanese sailor of 1944 had been raised in a society that prized obedience and deference to authority as the highest virtues. His training reinforced the hierarchy. When a crisis exceeded his training, he waited for instructions from above. The American sailor had been raised in a country where the man who waited for instructions while the barn was burning was the man the neighbors talked about for the wrong reasons. He did not need a doctrine to tell him to act. He had been acting his whole life. The third part is the one that no amount of training or engineering can replicate without the infrastructure to support it. The third part is Service Squadron 10. If you have never heard of Service Squadron 10, you are not alone. It is one of the least known and most consequential organizations of the entire Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz called it his secret weapon, and he was not exaggerating. Service Squadron 10 was the floating Navy yard that the Americans built at Ulithi Atoll, a ring of coral islands in the western Caroline Islands, 900 miles east of the Philippines. The lagoon at Ulithi was enormous, capable of sheltering more than 700 vessels, a capacity greater than either Majuro or Pearl Harbor. At its peak, on March 13, 1945, 722 ships were anchored in the lagoon. 12 months earlier, it had been an uninhabited atoll that most American naval officers had never heard of. By early 1945, roughly 6,000 shipfitters, welders, artificers, carpenters, and electricians, under Commodore Worrell R. Carter, were at work aboard repair ships, destroyer tenders, and floating dry docks large enough to lift a 45,000-ton battleship out of the water. The men came from the same civilian trades that were feeding the damage control parties on the combat ships. They were the same kind of men, welders from the shipyards in Norfolk and Bremerton and Bath, mechanics who had been fixing heavy machinery before the war, electricians who could trace a circuit through a blown junction box by feel. They were doing at Ulithi what the damage control parties were doing at sea, fixing things that were broken, under pressure, with whatever was available. The squadron's capability was staggering. In March of 1945, Service Squadron 10 rebuilt 60 feet of the carrier Randolph's flight deck in 18 days after a kamikaze strike at anchor. In a single month, the squadron repaired 52 vessels in floating dry docks. Cruisers that had been torpedoed and were taking on water were towed to Ulithi, patched, and made either battle-ready or seaworthy enough for the long voyage home to a continental shipyard. Damaged destroyers arrived with their sterns blown off and left with new sterns welded on. Carriers arrived with holes in their flight decks and left with the holes plated over and the deck relaid. This was being done 1,000 miles from the nearest American territory and 4,000 miles from the nearest major shipyard on a coral atoll that had not had a single American on it 12 months earlier. Japan had nothing like it. A damaged Japanese warship had two options: reach a home dockyard or be lost. The transit from the combat zone to Japan was thousands of miles of submarine-infested ocean, and by 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japanese yards could repair them. The American fleet could take a hit, steam a few hundred miles to Ulithi, get welded back together in a week, and return to the fight. The Japanese fleet could take a hit and lose the ship. This logistical asymmetry was as important as any weapon in the American arsenal, and the Japanese High Command never fully grasped its scale. The reason they never grasped it is connected to the thing that was happening on the other side of the equation, inside the Japanese Navy itself. Because while the Americans were learning to save ships, the Japanese were losing ships in ways that had nothing to do with American firepower and everything to do with a failure so fundamental it is almost painful to describe. On June 19, 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese carrier Taiho, the newest and most heavily armored carrier in the Imperial Navy, designed specifically with an armored flight deck to survive bomb hits that would have destroyed older carriers, was struck by a single torpedo from the American submarine USS Albacore, one torpedo. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic. The torpedo ruptured aviation fuel lines and flooded the forward elevator pit with a mixture of seawater, fuel oil, and aviation gasoline. There was no fire. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, whose flag was aboard Taiho, ordered the elevator well covered with mess tables and benches so that flight operations could continue. The leaking gasoline was vaporizing, and the fumes were spreading through the enclosed hangar spaces. A damage control officer, in a decision that has been studied in naval war colleges ever since, as an example of what happens when damage control training is inadequate, ordered the ventilation ducts opened to clear the fumes. The ducts did not clear the fumes. They spread them. Flammable aviation, gasoline vapor, now distributed through multiple compartments of the ship, reached an ignition source at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, roughly 6 hours after the torpedo hit. The explosion blew out sections of the hull and started fires the crew could not fight. Taiho continued to burn and flood for another 2 hours before sinking stern first at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, taking roughly 1,650 of her crew with her. The most modern carrier in the Japanese fleet, an armored deck carrier specifically designed to absorb punishment, had been destroyed by a single torpedo because her crew did not know how to manage leaking fuel. 5 months later, the lesson was repeated on an even more grotesque scale. On November 29, 1944, the carrier Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, a converted Yamato-class battleship hull, displacing roughly 72,000 tons, was torpedoed on her maiden transit from Yokosuka to Kure by the American submarine USS Archerfish under Commander Joseph F. Enright. 4 torpedoes hit. The damage should not have been fatal to a ship of that size with proper watertight integrity. Shinano was designed to absorb this kind of punishment, but Shinano's watertight doors had not been installed. The holes cut in bulkheads for cables and piping had not been sealed. The fire mains lacked pumps. The green crew, assembled barely days before sailing, had never been drilled in the use of the portable pumps that were aboard. Many of them had never served on a carrier before. Captain Toshio Abe had seen the state of the ship and had requested a delay in the sailing date precisely because the ship was not yet watertight. His request was refused. Higher command had decided that the risk of American air attack on Yokosuka was greater than the risk of sailing an unfinished ship through submarine waters, a calculation that would prove to be one of the costliest misjudgments of the entire Pacific War. When the torpedoes hit, flooding spread from compartment to compartment through the unsealed openings the shipyard had left behind, through cable runs and pipe chases that should have been plugged, through doors that should have been shut and dogged but were not there to be shut. The crew fought the flooding for hours but had neither the training nor the equipment to stop it. Within 7 hours, Shinano capsized and sank, taking approximately 1,435 men with her. She was the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. She had been in commission for 10 days. The post-war American Naval Technical Mission Analysis confirmed that her loss owed not to any failure of her armor or structural design, but to poor watertight integrity and inadequate damage control. Before we go further, I want to ask you to stop and consider what the Taiho and Shinano disasters reveal about the Japanese Navy as a system. These were not old ships with old crews. Taiho was the newest carrier in the fleet. Shinano was the largest carrier ever built. Both were destroyed not by overwhelming force, but by a single torpedo each, in one case, and 4 torpedoes in the other, damage that an American carrier of equivalent size would almost certainly have survived. The difference was not in the steel, it was in the assumptions underneath it. The American Navy assumed your ship would be hit, and when it was, every man aboard had to know how to keep it afloat. The Japanese Navy assumed the attack was what mattered, and that damage was something to be absorbed by the spirit of the crew, rather than managed by their skill. When spirit was not enough, the ships died. And that was what was happening, invisibly. Every time a kamikaze hit an American ship and the ship did not die, the Japanese pilot gave his life. The American crew saved their ship. And the exchange rate that the entire kamikaze strategy depended on, 1 life for 1 ship, collapsed to 1 life for 1 repair job. The kamikaze program contained a flaw so fundamental that it would have destroyed the program's strategic logic even if every American ship hit had been made of paper. But to understand the flaw, you have to understand how the program began and why the men who created it believed it would work. In October of 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi took command of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. The 1st Air Fleet was a shadow of what it had been. Onishi had fewer than 100 operational aircraft, many of them obsolete, with pilots too inexperienced to execute conventional torpedo or dive bombing attacks against a heavily defended fleet. Japanese tests the previous month had concluded that conventional bombing achieved hits with only about 1 in 4 skilled crews, and the 1st Air Fleet did not have skilled crews. On the night of October 19th, at Mabalacat Airfield near Clark Field, Onishi met with the officers of the 201st Air Group and proposed something that no modern military had attempted as organized doctrine. He proposed that pilots fly their aircraft directly into American warships. The logic was stark. If a pilot could not be trusted to release a bomb accurately, he could be trusted to aim the entire aircraft. The hit rate would rise dramatically. The cost would be absolute. Onishi told the pilots their nobility of spirit would keep the homeland from ruin even in defeat. The 1st Special Attack Unit was organized that night. On October 25th, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the Shikishima unit against the escort carriers of the American 7th Fleet off Sama, sinking the escort carrier USS St. Lo, the first major warship destroyed by an organized kamikaze attack. By the end of the Philippines campaign, the results looked promising enough to expand the program to a scale that no one involved in that first meeting at Mabalacat had imagined. The flaw was informational. The man with the best view of the damage was the pilot. The pilot was dead. He died at the moment of impact. There was no post-strike assessment, no bomb damage analysis, no trained observer circling the target to report whether the ship was sinking, burning, or listing. The only reports came from escort fighters flying at distance through anti-aircraft fire, and those reports were wildly optimistic. A ship on fire was reported as sinking. A ship trailing smoke was reported as dead in the water. A near miss that threw up a geyser of water was reported as a direct hit. The Japanese command compounded the problem by accepting the optimistic reports at face value and then basing future operations on them. The pattern was established even before the kamikaze campaign formally began. At the air battle off Formosa in October of 1944, Japanese pilots returned to base, claiming to have sunk 11 carriers and 2 battleships. Imperial General Headquarters announced a great victory. Admiral Soemu Toyoda redirected fleet assets to pursue the crippled American fleet. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the first wave at Pearl Harbor and who was by then serving as air staff officer to the combined fleet, gave his assessment of the Formosa battle to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey after the war. He told his interrogators that the combined fleet's own estimate had been more modest, that they thought they had sunk 1 carrier and damaged 2. Even that was wrong. In reality, not a single American ship was sunk off Formosa. 2 cruisers, Canberra and Houston, were torpedoed and towed to safety. The American carrier fleet appeared intact at Leyte Gulf days later, and the Japanese plan built on the Phantom Formosa victory collapsed. The same feedback loop ran through the entire kamikaze campaign. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, who had served as Chief of Staff of the 1st Air Fleet and helped organize the original kamikaze units alongside Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, provided his own assessment after the war. Inoguchi was one of the few men alive who had been present at the creation of the kamikaze program and had also survived to see its results measured against reality. In his account, co-authored with Commander Tadashi Nakajima, Inoguchi estimated that approximately 1/6 of kamikaze aircraft in the Philippines and 1/9 at Okinawa actually hit their targets. The ratio was falling as pilot quality declined and American defenses improved. He tallied the gap between Japanese claims and American records. Japan claimed 81 ships sunk and 195 damaged. The actual figures were 34 sunk and 288 damaged. At Okinawa alone, the distortion was even more extreme. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, interrogated by the Strategic Bombing Survey, described the informational blindness from the command level. He told his interrogators that during action he received no report of American damage and that he never did receive full information. He conceded that American maneuvering ability had improved to the point where his forces could not successfully deliver attacks strong enough to sink their targets. What Ozawa was describing, without quite saying it, was the intersection of 2 systems, one that could hit and one that could survive being hit, and the inability of the system that could hit to learn from its own results, because every observer died before he could report. The Japanese had built a weapon designed to trade one life for one ship. The Americans had built a system designed to make sure the trade did not work. The weapon required accurate feedback to be refined. The system denied that feedback by keeping the ships afloat after the hit, which meant the pilot's death produced not a sinking but a repair job, and the repair job was invisible to the next wave of pilots, who would fly the same mission based on the same flawed intelligence about the same ships that were no longer on the bottom of the ocean. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, in any branch, aboard any ship or on any island, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What ship? What unit? Where did they serve? What did they remember? Those details, the small, specific, personal things, matter more than any official archive. They are the actual record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. The verdict on the Kamikaze campaign, the honest one, is that it was not defeated primarily by anti-aircraft fire or by combat air patrols, though both of those killed hundreds of aircraft before they could reach the fleet. The Kamikaze campaign was defeated by the men who were still aboard the ship after the impact. It was defeated by the cook who grabbed a fog nozzle and ran toward a fire instead of away from it. It was defeated by the engineering officer who went below into a blacked-out compartment full of smoke and steam to raise pressure in a boiler that the entire crew thought was destroyed. It was defeated by the chaplain who organized damage control parties when the damage control officer was dead. It was defeated by the welder at Ulithi who worked a double shift to close a hole in a flight deck so the carrier could rejoin the task force before the next Kikusui wave arrived. It was defeated by a system, not a weapon, and the system was built from parts that no Japanese strategist had accounted for, training that reached every man, design that anticipated the hit, logistics that turned a coral lagoon into a shipyard, and a culture, the culture of the man who fixes the thing in front of him because it needs fixing, and he is the one who is there. The Japanese had built the Kamikaze around an idea of sacrifice, that the willingness to die was the ultimate weapon. The Americans answered with an idea of survival, that the willingness to keep fighting after you had been hit was worth more than the willingness to die hitting. O'Callaghan did not sacrifice himself. He saved a ship. Gary did not die going below. He came back up with 300 men. Beckton did not go down with Laffey. He kept Laffey from going down at all. These were not acts of martyrdom. They were acts of craft and stubbornness and reflex, performed by men who had been given the tools and the training and the trust to do the work, and who did it because the ship was on fire, and they were the ones standing in the passageway with a hose. The Japanese High Command spent the last months of the war believing the kamikazes were winning because the only numbers they had said the kamikazes were winning. 217 ships sunk at Okinawa. The actual number was 36. The carriers that were supposed to be at the bottom of the Philippine Sea were at Ulithi being welded back together. The destroyers that were supposed to be gone were back on the picket line within weeks. The fleet that was supposed to be broken was getting larger. Nobody in Tokyo could explain it. They did not have the information to explain it, and even if they had, they did not have the conceptual framework. The idea that damage control was not just a defensive afterthought, but an active strategic capability, a system that could neutralize an entire category of weapon by refusing to let the weapon's effect become permanent, was not a concept the Japanese naval tradition had ever developed. Every ship the Japanese built was an instrument of offense. Every doctrine they wrote prioritized the strike. The possibility that the enemy's ability to absorb punishment could matter more than your ability to inflict it was outside their strategic vocabulary. And when the war came down to which fleet could take the hit and keep fighting, the fleet that had built its identity around endurance outlasted the fleet that had built its identity around the blow. Every one of the men named in this account was real. Commander Frederick Beckton, who would not abandon Laffey while a gun could fire, was real. Ensign Robert Thomson, who died leading a fire party at 22 years old, was real. Father Joseph O'Callaghan, the Jesuit who led men into burning magazines, was real. Donald Gary, who went into the dark below Franklin and brought 300 men out, was real. Harold Burke and Thomas Kilduff, the fire department officers who taught the Navy how to fight fires, were real. The 1,400 shipyard workers who put Yorktown back together in 3 days were real. The 6,000 welders and fitters at Ulithi, who rebuilt carriers on a coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific, were real. Most of their names do not appear in any history book. They were not admirals. They were not strategists. They were men with wrenches and welding torches and fog nozzles who kept the ships afloat because the ships were on fire, and they were the ones who were there. The Japanese called the Kamikaze the Divine Wind, after the typhoon that had destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet in the 13th century. They believed it would destroy another invasion fleet in the 20th. It did not, because between the divine wind and the ocean floor, there were men in fireproof suits with hose lines and portable pumps who did not believe the ship had to die. And ship after ship, hit after hit, fire after fire, they were right. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this analysis reach the viewers who care about getting the history right. Not the history that flatters and not the history that flattens, but the history that actually happened, with the names, the details, and the inconvenient facts intact. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men who, at one moment in the middle of the ocean or on the deck of a burning ship, decided that the situation required something, and that the someone who had to do it was them. They had names. They came from somewhere. They learned how to fix before they learned how to fight, and they deserve to be remembered not by the fires they walked into, but by the ships they walked out of.